Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far colder than any medieval dungeon. The quiet, calculated horror behind one of history's most infamous executions, Anne Boleyn. There's nothing quite like imagining yourself locked inside a freezing tower, waiting day after day without knowing when death will knock and still having to smile at the guards. You think you could survive in Tudor times? Sorry, even being called queen only lasts until the king changes his mind. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening to this from New York, London, or anywhere else in the world, drop a comment and let me know what city you're in and what time it is. Who knows, someone else might be wide awake, just like you, listening to this story in the stillness of night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne Boleyn, a dazzling name once sung through every great hall, now prepares to disappear beneath the blade of a stranger from France. You might be lying on your side right now, one hand tucked under your cheek, the other tracing the edge of the blanket. Everything is quiet. But imagine just a few breaths from now you don't know whether you'll live or die. That in-between feeling, thin as mist, is where Anne Boleyn existed during the last 17 days of her life. From a queen lifted to the throne amid the bells of Westminster Abbey, to a woman imprisoned in the Tower of London, it only took 3 years. 3 years, the same amount of time it takes you to binge-watch a long TV series and forget the plot. But for Anne, it was a lifetime of rising and falling. What makes it chilling isn't the blade, but the strange calm described of her. When the guard knocked on her cell door, Anne didn't scream, didn't bang on the walls, didn't faint. She smiled. A smile so faint some thought she had completely lost her mind. But modern psychologists call it dissociation, a defense mechanism when facing unbearable trauma. You know, like when you sit an exam and the questions are so hard, your brain just goes for a walk instead of thinking. An interesting detail: not everyone knows Henry VIII, instead of allowing a traditional English axe execution, specially hired a swordsman from France said to be more gentle. Sounds humane, doesn't it? But don't be fooled. The truth is, Henry orchestrated everything, so Anne's death would be a performance. A clean ending to the most scandalous love story of the Tudor dynasty. And you think live streaming was invented in the 21st century? Not at all. Back then, public executions were the #1 reality show. Historians still debate whether the charges against Anne, adultery, incest, treason, had any real basis. The evidence was vague, the witnesses easily bribed or tortured until they changed their statements. Many believe it was a show trial staged by Thomas Cromwell, the king's right-hand man whose power Anne had foolishly threatened. There are also strange stories passed down that before her execution, Anne requested to receive Holy Communion at 2 a.m. She knelt for hours at the altar in the small chapel, whispering prayers while her ladies-in-waiting stood silently. A scene both serene and shattered, as if her soul was curling into itself before the world tore it apart. If you've ever waited for an important call without knowing when it would come, then you can understand a bit of what Anne felt. The execution was first delayed, then delayed again and again, not because of technical issues, but because the king wanted it that way. That waiting stretched over hours and nights was a classic form of psychological torture, blurring the line between hope and despair. On the morning of May 19th, the London sky was unusually bright. A soft breeze, clear sunlight, birds chirping the air was so fresh it felt inappropriate, because it didn't match what was about to happen. Records say Anne walked out of her cell, smiling, dressed simply, her hair neatly tied. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't ask for mercy. But there was one thing: she didn't have a coffin. That's right, no one had prepared a coffin for her. When her head fell and her blood seeped into the low wooden scaffold, the noble ladies, once her closest friends, had to scramble to find a container called an arrow chest to place her body in. Imagine being the Queen of England and buried like a misplaced object. You wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. Probably cry first, then laugh later. Even more mysterious, it wasn't until the 19th century that her grave was identified in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Until then, no one knew exactly where she was. Henry had done an excellent job of erasing her. Statues, crests, portraits all removed, destroyed, or replaced. The name Anne Boleyn vanished from official records as if she had never existed. If you've ever wiped someone from your Instagram after a breakup, then Henry was the master of that game, except he didn't just unfollow, he executed. Perhaps the saddest part is that her daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. A child barely 3 years old, stripped of her mother, abandoned by her father, and shunned by the entire court. And yet, as you know, Elizabeth would go on to become Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. A vivid testament that sometimes the brightest things bloom from the darkest places. Like a lotus rising from the mud, though in this case the mud was soaked in a bit of Tudor blood. Have you noticed? In history, some people don't find peace even after death. Anne Boleyn is a perfect example. She wasn't just executed, she was edited out of history as if she never existed. A clean delete, no confirmation needed. Like a real-life control plus Z, only more terrifying because no one ever hit undo. Interestingly, despite being erased from the official memory, Anne persisted in folklore. Some claim to have seen her ghost wandering the Tower of London, clutching her own severed head. You see, some people have to carry baggage even after death. And not a suitcase, but their actual head. No one's sure if Anne's ghost ever checked into any haunted hotels, but if she did, she'd probably be a VIP guest. Now back to Tower Green, the site of it all. There's a detail often ignored by historical dramas. Anne's scaffold was only 90 centimeters high. No grand stairs, no towering platform. The point wasn't for her to see far, but for the crowd to see her up close. A literal form of bringing someone down. You don't need to be a director to see it. This was a stage built to kill an icon, not just a woman. Before kneeling, Anne said a few final words. Not long, not weeping, not dramatic. Just a short, rounded sentence described by historians as strangely obedient. Perhaps because she knew no matter what she said, her last words would be twisted by the king's interpretation. In the Tudor court, freedom of speech wasn't in the charter. You could speak, but you'd be misquoted. A tradition still popular in many modern offices. When the sword from Calais came down, it ended everything in one stroke, no need for a second. A cold precision that chills the spine. But more striking witnesses said that after her head fell, her eyes still blinked. Her lips still moved for a few seconds. Some believed she was still praying. Others said it was just a physiological reflex. Modern scientists suggest the brain can remain active for a few seconds after decapitation. A fact that might make you think twice before joking about losing your head. Honest, loyal ladies-in-waiting, the same ones who once accompanied her to church. Dressed her, styled her hair, now had to gather her remains. Not because they wanted to, but because no one else would. In that bleak moment, they hurried to find a wooden arrow chest to place both the queen's body and head inside. No silk, no flowers, no hymns. Just the creak of wood and tears, swallowed in silence. Some of them left court afterward. Some joined convents, and some never spoke of that day again. But what few notice is this Anne's execution didn't just end a life. It opened a new political chapter. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour just 2 weeks later. The king's speed in moving on would put modern dating apps to shame. The public hadn't even finished mourning the old queen before the court was celebrating a new one. If you've ever gone through a breakup and watched your ex marry someone else right away, sorry to say you share a vibe with a beheaded queen. As for Anne's daughter Elizabeth, her life seemed destined to be completely erased. No one called her a princess anymore. No one dressed her in fine clothes. But history loves reversals. In the end, it was Elizabeth who became one of the greatest queens in England's history, Elizabeth I, a powerful reminder that you should never underestimate a wounded child. Historians still debate the truth behind the charges against Anne. Some believe she was completely innocent. Others think she may have acted inappropriately, but not to the point of deserving execution. And then there are those like you listening now who no longer care whether she was guilty or not, because the point isn't about guilt. It's about how a woman was killed by both a sword and a whisper. You know, in every tragic story, there's always a why behind the downfall. In Anne Boleyn's case, she wasn't sent to the scaffold just because of adultery, as textbooks often write. It was a combination of all the things a woman wasn't supposed to be, especially in the Tudor court. If you've ever worked at a company where your boss once said, "I admire smart women," but started avoiding you in meetings once you got too competent, welcome to Anne's story. When she first met Henry VIII, Anne wasn't some timid flower. She was fire. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife, Anne was sharp, outspoken, not easily swayed, and most importantly refused to sleep with the king until he gave her a wedding ring. A strategy that drove Henry wild and sent the entire English church into chaos. Because to marry Anne, Henry divorced his first wife and broke up with the Pope. Yes, you heard right. Henry VIII split from the Roman Catholic Church just to crown Anne queen. You could call it the most scandalous husband-stealing drama in European history. And the cost, all of England broke away from Catholicism forming the Church of England, with Henry naming himself its head. See, some people will do everything to win you, but once they have you, they start to regret it. After the wedding, Anne gave birth to a daughter Elizabeth, but didn't produce a son. Meanwhile, Henry wanted a male heir to secure the Tudor bloodline. At the time, daughters were seen as unfinished demos, and that's when the cracks in their relationship began. Imagine Henry as a tyrannical CEO. When you were a promising project, he invested, heavily launched you with fanfare. But once the project didn't yield returns, in this case, no male heir, he started looking at you like a financial loss statement. But the deeper and more painful reason was that Anne refused to stay silent. She had opinions. She involved herself in politics. She spoke in council meetings. She had ideas about controlling the flow of power and money. And most dangerously, she crossed Thomas Cromwell, the king's right-hand man. Cromwell and Anne had once been allies in the divorce from Catherine, but later clashed over the redistribution of wealth from dissolved Catholic monasteries. Anne wanted the money used for education and charity. Cromwell wanted it in the royal treasury for easier allocation. When Cromwell saw she was becoming too influential, he did what courts have always done well, fabricate a story to bring her down. And so, a series of charges were fabricated. Anne had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. And you hearing this now might instinctively raise a hand to your forehead and whisper, "Oh no, this is straight out of a palace drama script." There was even a testimony claiming Anne had planned to poison the king, though no one could explain where she would have gotten poison from inside a heavily guarded tower. Stranger still, within just a few days, all 5 men were found guilty and executed effectively, confirming the adultery charges, before Anne's own trial had even begun. Modern historians are deeply skeptical of the entire trial. No concrete evidence, no reliable witnesses, only confessions obtained after many hours of interrogation. Apparently back then, forced confessions weren't an exception, they were a standard technique for cleaning up a file. A lesser-known fact among those coerced was Mark Smeaton, a musician at court, the only one of the accused who wasn't of noble blood and therefore not protected by laws against torture. He was the perfect scapegoat. A powerless man turned into the key proof used to bring down a queen. Do you notice a familiar pattern? A woman with ambition, intellect, and a voice is labeled dangerous simply for stepping into a space of power. And when power feels threatened, it doesn't need truth. It just needs a story the crowd will believe. If enough people believe you're guilty, then you're guilty. Fair trial not required. Just a convincing performance. You know, in every tragic story, there's always a why behind the downfall. In Anne Boleyn's case, she wasn't sent to the scaffold just because of adultery, as textbooks often write. It was a combination of all the things a woman wasn't supposed to be, especially in the Tudor court. If you've ever worked at a company where your boss once said, "I like smart women," but started avoiding you in meetings once you got too competent, welcome to Anne's story. When she first met Henry VIII, Anne wasn't some demure rose. She was fire. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife Anne was sharp, direct, not easily seduced, and most importantly, refused to go to bed with the king until there was a wedding ring. A strategy that drove Henry mad and sent the entire English church into chaos. Because to marry Anne, Henry was willing to divorce his wife and break up with the Pope. Yes, you heard right. Henry VIII severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church just to put Anne on the throne. You could call it the most scandalous husband-snatching drama in Europe at the time. And the cost, England broke away from Catholicism and formed the Church of England, with Henry naming himself its head. See, some people will do everything to win you. But once they have you, they start to regret it. After the wedding, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but didn't produce a son. Meanwhile, Henry wanted a male heir to secure the Tudor bloodline. At that time, daughters were considered unfinished demos, and that's when the relationship began to fall apart. Think of Henry like a tyrannical CEO. When you were a promising project, he invested big, gave you a flashy launch. But once the project didn't yield returns, in this case, no son, he began seeing you as a growing liability. But the deeper and sadder reason was this. Anne refused to stay silent. She had opinions. She involved herself in politics. She spoke in council meetings. She wanted to influence the flow of power and, well, the flow of funds. And most critically, she crossed Thomas Cromwell, the king's right-hand man. Cromwell and Anne had once been allies in the divorce from Catherine, but later clashed over how to distribute wealth from the dissolved Catholic monasteries. Anne wanted the money used for education and charity. Cromwell wanted it funneled into the royal treasury to be more easily allocated. When Cromwell saw that her influence was growing too strong, he did what royal courts have always done best, made something up to bring her down. So a series of accusations were concocted. Anne had committed adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. And you hearing this might place a hand on your forehead and whisper, "Oh no, here comes the palace drama script." There were even claims that Anne had planned to poison the king, though no one could explain how she would have obtained poison in such a tightly guarded tower. Stranger still, within just a few days, all 5 men were found guilty and executed effectively, stamping the adultery charge as confirmed before Anne's own trial had even begun. Modern historians remain skeptical of the entire trial. There was no hard evidence, no reliable witnesses, only confessions extracted after long hours of interrogation. It seems that back then forced confessions weren't rare. They were a standard method for cleaning up a case. A lesser-known detail among those forced to confess was Mark Smeaton, a court musician, the only one among the accused who wasn't of noble birth and therefore not protected by anti-torture laws. He was the perfect scapegoat, a powerless man turned into the key evidence that brought down a queen. Do you see a familiar pattern? A woman with ambition, intellect, and a voice is labeled dangerous simply because she dares to enter a space of power. And when power feels threatened, it doesn't need truth. It just needs a story that can sway the crowd. If enough people believe you're guilty, then you are. A fair trial isn't required. Just a convincing performance. Can you picture it? A palace banquet, candlelight flickering against stone walls. The soft sound of a lute in the background, and in the center of the room, a man in a crimson velvet coat, his gaze sweeping over the crowd like a hunter choosing his prey. That was Henry VIII, King of England, the most powerful, the richest, and the most bored with his wife at the time. Then his eyes stopped on Anne Boleyn. Not because Anne was the most beautiful woman in the room. Many records claim her sister Mary Boleyn was the one with striking looks. But Anne had something very few women dared to show. In those days, confidence without humility. She wasn't flirtatious, she didn't beg, and above all, she wasn't easy. A rare quality that Henry used to women yielding to him couldn't resist. Henry began courting Anne in royal fashion, handwritten letters, lavish jewelry, even offering to make her the king's official mistress. But Anne, instead of being flattered, said no. You might think that would have made the king angry. Maybe. But it also drew him in deeper. They say things that come easily are easily forgotten. Anne was not. She demanded respect. She wanted marriage not to be a footnote in royal lust. And so began a tangled journey. Henry loved her enough to defy the Catholic Church to seek a divorce, a scandalous and nearly impossible act at the time. And what happens when a king isn't granted permission from the Vatican to divorce? That's right, he breaks away from the Vatican. Henry VIII decided to sever ties with the Pope, established the Church of England, and named himself its head, all just to marry Anne Boleyn. See, some people change their Facebook profile picture after a breakup. Henry changed the state religion, and you think you've ever loved someone madly? Try orchestrating a nationwide religious schism. After nearly 7 years of pursuit, Henry finally married Anne in 1533 in a rushed and secret ceremony. Anne was crowned queen and not long after became pregnant. It all seemed like a dream come true, at least for Henry. He was certain Anne would give him what his first wife could not, a male heir. But it was a daughter. Baby Elizabeth, who would later become Queen Elizabeth I, was born under a cloud of disappointment. No one knew that this child would one day rule England more gloriously than any man. But in that moment, there was only silence. Henry tried to remain composed, but his heart began to crack. Anne felt the pressure. In her efforts to produce a son, she became pregnant several more times, but each ended in miscarriage. One was recorded to have happened shortly after Henry was severely injured in a jousting accident. Something many people at the time believed was a bad omen. You see, in those days, people didn't seek out doctors when something went wrong. They looked for hidden meanings. Day by day, Henry grew colder, and at court, a new name began to emerge. Jane Seymour, a quiet, reserved lady-in-waiting, who was nothing like Anne. While Anne exploded like fireworks, Jane stood still like an oak-paneled wall, and Henry began to notice that stillness. Love cracked. Courtiers shifted their loyalties. And Anne, once a queen raised up with a grand coronation, began to feel the fractures behind the throne. But she did not retreat. She still spoke up, still sat in council, still voiced her opinions on policy. A fact that irritated many, especially Thomas Cromwell. This was when politics stepped into love. Thomas Cromwell, the man who once helped Henry marry Anne, now became the man who brought her down, because Anne had dared to challenge decisions about confiscated church assets. She wanted the money used for schools and hospitals. Cromwell wanted to funnel it into the royal treasury, and so she became an obstacle. And as the rule goes, in every court, obstacles must disappear. A string of accusations was manufactured that Anne had committed adultery, that she used witchcraft to seduce men, that she plotted to kill the king. Accusations that required no proof, only volume and repetition. One night, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. And from there, you already know what happened. Did you know that before Henry VIII became the king who collected wives, like stamps he once truly loved? And that woman was Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, who stood by him for over 20 years and who marked the beginning of all the storms that followed. Catherine was no obscure figure. She was the Princess of Spain, daughter of the most powerful couple in Europe, at the time Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the Catholic world's ultimate power couple. Calling Catherine highborn doesn't even cover it. She was the embodiment of the military, religious, and political alliance between two of Europe's leading kingdoms. Originally, Catherine was married to Arthur, the elder brother of Henry VIII, heir to the English throne. But Arthur died just months after their wedding, leaving Catherine a teenage widow alone in a foreign palace. It seemed her story would end there. But the king at the time, Henry VII, didn't want to lose the Spanish alliance, so he arranged for Catherine to marry his second son, Henry VIII. And yes, you're counting right, Henry married his brother's widow. Naturally, this created a theological headache. According to Catholic law, marrying your brother's wife was forbidden unless the first marriage had not been consummated. Catherine insisted that she and Arthur had never gone all the way. Believe it or not, that was up to the Church, and the Pope eventually issued a special dispensation allowing them to marry. And so, in 1509, Henry, just 17 years old, married Catherine, who was 6 years his senior. Their marriage was genuinely harmonious at first. Catherine was intelligent, kind, and had the bearing of a true queen. Henry loved her deeply, even once calling her the only woman I ever loved, though he would later call that an emotional typo. The only issue, and the one that triggered the entire Tudor tragedy, was this: she didn't give birth to a son. Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times, but only one child survived Mary, who would later become Bloody Mary, Queen of England. But at the time, daughters were not considered reliable heirs. Henry, obsessed with securing a male successor, began to see his wife as a mistake of fate. And then Anne Boleyn appeared. Younger, more alluring. And most importantly, never married. That made Henry question, wasn't my marriage to Catherine wrong from the start? After all, she had been my brother's wife. He began calling their union invalid in the eyes of God. Henry wrote to the Pope requesting an annulment, but the Pope refused, in part because he didn't want to offend Spain, where Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor, and so Henry went into a rage. No church approval, fine. Create his own church. No one daring to say Catherine was no longer queen, fine. Declare it himself. And so Catherine was expelled from court, forbidden to be called queen, and separated from her daughter, Mary. Some historians believe Henry truly thought he was doing the right thing, that not having a son was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. But others think that was just an excuse to legitimize his relationship with Anne Boleyn. For Catherine, the tragedy lay in this: she never renounced the title of queen. Until her death, she still signed her name, Catalina Regina Catherine the Queen. She lived in exile, in loneliness, forbidden from seeing her daughter, and died in 1536, the same year Anne Boleyn was executed. Fate certainly knows how to write poetic tragedy. Just imagine you're a young girl, once a rightful princess, daughter of a queen revered by the entire kingdom. Then suddenly your mother is dismissed, stripped of her title, and referred to as Lady Catherine of Aragon instead of queen. And you're declared illegitimate. Your title as princess is revoked, your castles taken back, and those who once bowed to you now turn their backs. That was the reality for Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, when Anne Boleyn entered King Henry VIII's life and unintentionally shattered Mary's childhood. Anne Boleyn and Mary Tudor, the replacement and the forgotten child. When Anne officially became queen in 1533, Henry forced the entire court to recognize Anne's daughter baby Elizabeth as the legitimate heir and issued an order stripping Mary of her status. A decree was passed requiring Mary to refer to her father as His Majesty and Anne as the Queen, or be considered guilty of treason. Do you think Mary complied? No. Mary refused to bow. She never recognized Anne Boleyn as queen and continued to refer to her mother as Queen Catherine even while living in isolation and being forbidden from contacting her. At one point, Mary was confined in desolate castles, without ladies-in-waiting, without medicine, and her health deteriorated severely. As for Anne, many historians agree that she was not the wicked woman portrayed in some films, but she certainly felt threatened by Mary's presence. Mary's refusal to submit enraged Anne, and at one point she reportedly told Henry that Mary should be tried for treason. However, there are also records indicating that Anne secretly pleaded with Henry to allow her to reconcile with Mary, understanding the pain of a child separated from her mother. But Henry refused, believing that only when Mary surrendered could he maintain his image as the king who is never wrong. What's heartbreaking is this: both Mary and Elizabeth, half-sisters, had to grow up divided by the political battles created by adults. They were pitted against each other when, in truth, neither of them had any say in the circumstances of their birth. Elizabeth I and her thorny sister, Mary Tudor. When Anne was executed in 1536, little Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old. And do you know what the bitterest part is? Right after Anne's death, Henry declared Elizabeth illegitimate as well. Yes, from being the most beloved princess in court, she suddenly became a nameless child removed from the line of succession, just like her sister. In one instant, 2 children, daughters of 2 women who had both loved the same man, were cast aside, left with nothing but the Tudor name and a mountain of prejudice. Yet fate had its own plan, and both Mary and Elizabeth eventually ascended the throne. In 1553, Mary became the first reigning queen of England. She summoned Elizabeth back to court. At this time, the seemingly iron-hearted elder sister still harbored deep resentment toward Anne Boleyn. She referred to Elizabeth's mother as a French witch and saw Elizabeth's very existence as a curse, reminding her of her mother's suffering. Elizabeth, still young, was extremely cautious. She never expressed her opinions, did not oppose her sister's Catholic policies, and always appeared utterly loyal. But that wasn't enough. Mary continued to suspect Elizabeth's involvement in plots against her, especially the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554. The result: Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same place where her mother had once been held and executed. You might be thinking history repeats itself in the cruelest ways. And you'd be right. Elizabeth spent weeks in the very room where Anne had awaited death. Records state that Elizabeth wept often and once told a guard, "I do not deserve to die. If I die, it is because I bear the name Tudor." Fortunately, Mary did not order her execution. Elizabeth was released, but remained under strict surveillance. The 2 sisters were never truly close. In the Tudor court, sisterhood was not forged in blood, but in suspicion. 1 family, 3 women, 3 destinies. Catherine, the first wife, loyal until the end, died in solitude, but never bowed her head. Anne, the woman who dared to challenge the entire court, lived brilliantly and died tragically. Elizabeth, the cast-off child, doubted, pushed away from every support, yet ultimately became the most radiant symbol of England's golden age. And Mary ruled for only 5 years, but left behind the nickname Bloody Mary due to her fierce religious persecutions. She died childless, leaving the throne to the very sister she had once distrusted, Elizabeth I. In 1558, when Mary Tudor breathed her last, no one mourned her like a sister. There was no heir, no statue built in her lifetime. Only the silence of the court and a question that echoed in everyone's mind. Will Elizabeth do better? Elizabeth, then just 25, was summoned to court. Upon hearing she was now officially Queen of England, she is said to have spoken only one sentence: "This is the Lord's doing." A whisper, not a proclamation. But beneath those words, everyone understood the child once called illegitimate, once imprisoned in the tower, once hidden under the shadow of so much pain, had become queen. You can imagine the coronation scene, winter light casting a glow on the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey, bells ringing and a hushed crowd watching a red-haired woman in a velvet cloak walk forward, not with the air of a princess, but of a survivor. But Elizabeth didn't ascend the throne with just a crown. She inherited a divided nation, a court full of spies, and most importantly, a surname, Boleyn, that no one dared to speak. Imagine that becoming queen while bearing the name of someone who had been executed. Your mother had no proper grave, no statue, no portrait. In royal archives, every trace of her had been hidden, erased, rewritten. Elizabeth knew this, and though she never spoke of it, she carried it like a slow-burning secret. Historians still debate today. Did Elizabeth truly love her mother, Anne Boleyn, because she rarely spoke of Anne publicly? But if you look closely, you'll see quiet signs like someone who keeps a lost loved one's photo in a drawer, not from forgetfulness, but from pain. Elizabeth never restored her mother's title. She held no memorial. But she cared deeply for the Boleyn family. She granted titles to Anne's relatives, kept them close as loyal satellites. She quietly had the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her mother lay buried without a name, restored and preserved. Elizabeth's way of confronting her mother's legacy was not to shout, "I am Anne Boleyn's daughter," but to rebuild what had been broken piece by piece. No declarations, just quiet acts. And most importantly, Elizabeth chose not to marry. This sparked enormous controversy. After all, a queen without a husband meant no clear heir. Yet she refused every proposal, even from European princes, who could have strengthened her political alliances. Many believe Elizabeth feared marriage. She had seen too clearly its consequences, her mother beheaded for not bearing a son, her sister Mary deceived by Philip II, and she herself had been threatened with marriages used as political traps. To Elizabeth, marriage wasn't love, it was a snare. You've probably heard her title, the Virgin Queen. But it didn't just refer to her unmarried status. It was a declaration. She was queen of the people, belonging to no man. And in a world where a woman was valued by her husband or her children, that was the greatest rebellion of all. Elizabeth's reign lasted 45 years, one of the most stable and glorious periods in English history. Under her rule, England defeated the Spanish Armada, expanded its navy and trade, and witnessed a flourishing of the arts with names like Shakespeare. But no matter how far she went, the past followed her like a shadow. There's a little-known story that during a visit to the Tower Chapel, Elizabeth stood for a long time before the Eastern Wall. Behind those cold stones lay the grave of her mother, Anne Boleyn. She said nothing, just stood in silence, then ordered that no one be allowed into that area while she remained there. No flowers, no candles, no tears, just a daughter standing quietly before the grave of a forgotten mother. And throughout her life, Elizabeth never took revenge on those who had helped destroy her mother, not the Seymour family nor Cromwell's descendants. She chose to rule with reason, not resentment. Perhaps it was the only way she could survive. In a world where memory was a blade and vulnerability was a death sentence, Elizabeth chose not to speak, but never to forget. You see, history is not only what happens, it's also what people endure in silence. Anne was severed from the court. Mary grew up in bitterness, and Elizabeth, the survivor, carried the wounds of both. If you're listening to this in a quiet room with soft lamplight beside you, please remember, these women are not just names in history books. They were souls who once loved, once suffered, and were shaped by a world that gave them no choice. Imagine living in a world where one man could decide whether you lived or died with a single frown. In Tudor England, that man was Henry VIII. At first, Henry wasn't like that. When he came to the throne, he was young, handsome, athletic, musical, poetic, a true royal heartthrob. The people adored him. The nobles admired him. Catherine of Aragon believed she would live her life as queen. But power, as you know, doesn't just reveal someone, it transforms them. And Henry once, a lover of the arts, gradually became a tyrant beneath a gilded crown. It all began with an obsession to have a son. To Henry, nothing mattered more than securing the Tudor bloodline. He believed God had chosen him to be king, and therefore God must also want him to have a male heir. When Catherine didn't give birth to a son, he didn't wonder if the problem might lie with him. No. He believed it was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. And so he decided to request a divorce. But the Pope refused. Catherine was the niece of the Holy Roman Emperor, a man far too influential in the Vatican. And what did Henry do? He separated England from the Catholic Church. He founded the Church of England, declared himself supreme head of the Church, a religious revolution just because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. That was the first sign of tyranny. When not granted approval, Henry didn't compromise. He changed the entire system to suit his will. He then married Anne and had her executed when she failed to produce a son. Married Jane Seymour, who gave birth to Edward VI and then died in childbirth. Henry mourned for about 3 days. After that, he began planning his next marriage. And do you know what? With each marriage he created, new laws revised old ones, and then used those very laws to condemn anyone who opposed him. If you've ever played chess with someone who's both the player, the referee, and the rule-maker mid-game, then you understand who Henry VIII was. When he married his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, for political reasons, he immediately sought a divorce after their first meeting, claiming she wasn't attractive enough. In truth, he felt deceived by the portrait, as the artist had been too generous. But instead of executing her like Anne Boleyn, he spared her, perhaps because Anne of Cleves was wise enough to accept the divorce peacefully. She later lived comfortably and was still referred to as the king's sister, one of the few women who escaped Henry and kept her head. But his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, wasn't so lucky. When it was discovered she had prior relations before marriage and possibly had committed adultery afterward, Henry immediately ordered her execution. She was only 19 at the time. The height of his tyranny came when he enacted a law allowing people to be charged with treason simply for intent. No actions, no real conspiracy. Just suspicion was enough to cost someone their life. Can you imagine living in a society where a wrong thought could get you beheaded? In that world, silence was gold, and expressing an opinion was a signed death warrant. Henry frequently changed the Constitution to serve personal goals. He confiscated all the land of the monasteries, dissolved nearly 800 religious institutions, and turned their wealth into royal assets. Many people supported him at first because it made the state richer, but soon realized that when one man controls everything, there's nothing left to trust. Even close friends like Thomas More were executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the church. More had been a courtier, a scholar, and someone Henry deeply respected. But when he refused to approve the king's divorce, Henry simply said, "I do not need people to love me. I need people to obey me." That sentence, perhaps, is the clearest definition of a tyrant. Toward the end of his life, Henry became obese, ailing, short-tempered, and seemingly trusted no one. He struggled to walk, had a festering leg wound that would not heal, yet still demanded people kneel when he entered a room. Even near death, he ordered the execution of those he believed were looking at the throne longer than they should. You see, Henry VIII was not just a king with many wives. He was a living example of how absolute power corrupts, transforming a once ideal king into a little god who wrote the laws, interpreted them, and delivered the verdict himself. You may have heard the phrase, "Death makes us all equal." That may not have applied to Henry VIII. For even in his final hours, he remained a king, a paranoid, agonized, and terrifyingly lonely king. In the end, Henry VIII was no longer a symbol of strength. He became a ghostly figure weighing nearly 400 pounds, in so much pain he couldn't stand without being supported on both sides. And the worst part wasn't his body. It was his mind. The leg wound caused by a jousting accident in 1536 never fully healed. It festered, became infected, and reeked so badly that courtiers had to use heavy perfumes to mask the smell. A French ambassador once described that every time the king entered a room, it felt like a cloud of decay followed. If you're lying in bed right now, picture a dim room, candles flickering. And in the middle, a wide bed where Henry lay groaning, issuing commands, and sometimes laughing aloud, as if speaking to ghosts no one else could see. Yes, in his final days, Henry began seeing figures in his chambers. Some nights he called out Catherine of Aragon's name. Other nights he whispered Anne in his sleep, then woke up and smashed a mirror. He trusted no one, refused to let anyone near him, not even doctors, priests, or trusted aides. Many historians believe Henry suffered from paranoid delusions. He suspected everyone of plotting to poison him, even though he himself had once ordered others to be poisoned. He believed that his son Prince Edward could be stolen from him if he let his guard down for even a moment. Henry had killed most of those who had once been most loyal to him. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, 2 of his wives, and dozens of courtiers. And by the time he was dying, there were almost no people left who truly cared for him. There's a haunting story during one feverish spell, Henry demanded a mirror. But when he looked into it, he smashed it and screamed, "That's not me." Partly because he didn't recognize himself, and perhaps partly because he didn't want to believe that this was the ending of a royal life. Henry's condition was so dire that he couldn't relieve himself alone. Servants had to use a system of pulleys and straps to lift him something that filled him with both shame and rage. Every time someone mentioned preparing for his death, he would pound the table and shout, "I am not dead." But he knew, and everyone else knew, that death was drawing near. In January 1547, Henry's health completely collapsed. The doctors, without antibiotics or modern medicine, could only stand by and watch. He could no longer eat, couldn't sleep, and mostly muttered incoherently. Most terrifying of all, no one dared to tell him he was dying. Because the law at the time stated that if anyone declared the king near death without permission, it would be considered treason. Yes, even the king's death needed approval. Eventually, Anthony Denny, a priest known for his honesty and courage, sat beside Henry and asked, "Your Majesty, do you wish to make peace with God?" Henry was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. It is said that in that moment Henry was no longer a king, just a man afraid of a judgment greater than the throne. He whispered a prayer and drifted into unconsciousness. And on the morning of January 28th, 1547, Henry VIII took his last breath. No cannons fired, no grand music, only cold wind whistling through the halls of Whitehall Palace. He left behind a fractured England, a fledgling religion, and a tangled legacy that his son Edward VI would inherit at the age of just 9. And then Henry was buried next to Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son. Not Catherine, his companion of 20 years, not Anne, for whom he had changed an entire religion, but Jane, the one who died before she had a chance to disappoint him. Do you see? In the end, the one Henry loved most was the one who didn't live long enough to hurt him. If you're still listening at this point, perhaps your breathing has slowed, your eyelids are heavier, and the room is quieter than when we began. You don't need to remember every detail. Just remember, even a king who once held the power of life and death in his hands could not escape the end like everyone else. Henry VIII, a life of brilliance, but a death of loneliness. Now imagine being 9 years old. While your friends outside are still playing hide and seek or learning to spell, you are placed upon the throne of England. Every eye turns to you. Everything your father Henry VIII built, destroyed, and killed for is now your responsibility to preserve and develop. And you have no mother by your side. You don't have the power to make real decisions. All you have is fear. And that was Edward VI. He was the son of Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII, the only one who wasn't divorced, wasn't executed, but died after childbirth. Jane was considered the perfect wife simply because she bore a son and passed away before she could ever provoke the king's wrath. Henry once said he wished to be buried beside Jane, and indeed, he kept that promise. For Edward, that meant from the moment he opened his eyes, his mother was nothing more than a portrait, a quiet image hanging on a cold stone wall. Edward grew up under strict rules and an intense education program fit for a miniature archbishop. He was not allowed to cry loudly, not allowed to run or jump too much, and was constantly monitored by a team of tutors. All because the court knew if Edward failed, the entire overturned Catholic order and the Church of England would collapse with him. No pressure, just an entire religion and dynasty resting on a sickly child. Edward was intelligent, sharp, and studious. He read Latin fluently from a young age, loved theology, and had a strong interest in religious reform. But physically, he was frail. Historical records describe Edward as frequently coughing, losing weight, and as pale as a willow branch in the January wind. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was proclaimed King of England. He was only 9 years old. But in truth, he never ruled. Instead, a regency council was formed led by Edward Seymour, Edward's uncle, and the Duke of Somerset. And as you might guess, power has a way of making adults very uneasy. Edward VI reigned for 6 years, but throughout that time, he was pulled between factions of adults who wanted control under the pretense of protecting the king. First, Edward Seymour, then overthrown by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who effectively ran England like a CEO without a board of directors. And Edward, he was still called His Majesty, still signed decrees, still sat on the throne, but all decisions were made by others. One detail few notice: Edward deeply disliked his sister Mary Tudor. Because Mary was Catholic, while Edward, raised in Reformation ideals, saw her as a threat to the new church. Letters even record that Edward wanted her charged with heresy, though the council advised against it. It shows even at a young age he had internalized the political game. But he was still just a pawn. Edward's health began to deteriorate rapidly in 1552. He coughed up blood, ran constant fevers, and wasted away. Doctors had no idea what was happening. There was no understanding of tuberculosis or cancer at the time. All they knew was that Edward was weakening, and the court was panicking. Because if Edward died without an heir, the crown would fall to Mary, a Catholic. And that meant all the religious reforms of Henry's era could be undone. And Elizabeth, still unclear in her loyalties, still too young, and most notably, still a woman. In an era where men feared female rulers as much as they feared losing their thrones, Elizabeth wasn't the first choice. So on his deathbed, Edward was encouraged to name a successor. He chose Lady Jane Grey, a kind, gentle girl, a distant descendant of the Tudor line, and most importantly, a Protestant. Edward signed the document, "My device for the succession." A shaky, heavily amended paper that read more like a pressured last testament than a royal decree. And then in July 1553, Edward VI died. He was only 15 years old. No wife, no children, no victories, no glory. Just a boy born of expectation, raised in a gilded cage, and died as the most quickly forgotten king of the Tudor dynasty. Jane Grey took the throne for just 9 days. Then Mary reclaimed the crown, returned England to Catholicism, and executed Jane, a girl who had never even wanted to be queen. And Edward? He was buried in silence. No grand monument, no triumphal song. Only one thing remained: emptiness. You see, some people are born with a crown, yet never get to touch true power. And when they die, they don't leave behind victories, only a void for others to fight over. If you're hearing these words late at night, perhaps you've already sensed it. Not every ruler is happy. Sometimes a crown is the heaviest, most painful, and quietest object in the world. Mary began her reign with the hope of returning England to Roman Catholicism. It was her mother's dream. It was the faith she had defended since girlhood, and it was what Mary believed to be her sacred mission. She restored monasteries her father had dissolved, reopened ties with the Pope, and punished Protestant bishops. But the greatest and most controversial turning point came with the persecution of Protestants. Beginning in 1555, more than 280 people were burned alive as heretics. Among them were the elderly women scholars and priests, and their names were recorded in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, a work that later helped define the nickname Bloody Mary. But you should know this Mary was not the first nor the only monarch to execute people for their religious beliefs. At the time, the concept of freedom of religion did not exist. Both Catholics and Protestants viewed heresy as a crime equal to treason. Even Edward VI, her supposedly fragile younger brother, executed those who refused to convert. Elizabeth I, later celebrated for her tolerance, also executed many Catholics for secretly practicing their faith. So why was Mary the only one branded bloody? The answer lies in history written by the victors. When Elizabeth ascended the throne after Mary's death, the court wanted to erase the image of Catholicism and cast Mary as a bloody ghost of the past. Writers, historians, and Protestant clergy portrayed her as mad, fanatical, tyrannical. And thus, the nickname Bloody Mary was born. No fair trial, just repetition. Outside of politics, Mary's private life was filled with sorrow. In 1554, she married Philip II of Spain, hoping he would help solidify a Catholic alliance. But Philip was cold, seeing her only as a political chess piece. After the wedding, he stayed in England a few months and then left. Mary longed for a child. A few months after the wedding, her menstruation stopped, her belly grew, and everyone believed the Queen was pregnant. But time passed, and no child cried. It became clear Mary had a false pregnancy. Possibly fibroids, a hormonal disorder, or a delusion born of desperate hope. A year later, her belly flattened, her dreams shattered. She experienced a second false pregnancy and then fell into complete despair. No children, no love, and no one left who believed in her. In 1558, Mary died. It is said she took her last breath clutching a rosary, her eyes gazing toward the horizon as if searching for someone who would never return. Her successor was Elizabeth I, and from that moment on, Mary was rewritten as a page in history to be torn away. A cold-blooded queen, a religious shadow, a failure. But few remember that Mary never had the chance to live as a child, to love as a woman, or to rule as a free soul. You see, history isn't just filled with heroes and villains. It's filled with people who tried to love in a time that didn't allow them to love properly. Mary wasn't a monster. Perhaps she was just a heart drained to its last drop and turned into a symbol she never wanted to become. Wonderful. Let us return now to the woman who ignited a religious revolution, who once made a king rewrite church law, and who was then beheaded by a foreign sword, Anne Boleyn. But don't think her story ended at the scaffold. Not at all. Because if you listen carefully, especially on nights when the wind slides through the ancient stone towers of London, you'll hear that people still whisper about the ghost of Anne, a woman not only killed, but deliberately erased from history. And the souls of the erased rarely rest. The Tower of London, where shadows never sleep. There have been too many stories, too many witnesses, too many nights when no one dares stay past the stroke of midnight. One longtime tower guard once said that on May 19th, each year, the very day Anne was executed, someone has seen a woman in a gray Tudor dress wearing a high lace collar, cradling a bleeding head in her arms, walking slowly across Tower Green. She makes no sound, looks at no one. She simply follows the same path. and then vanishes into the eastern wall, where her body was once hastily buried in a crude wooden box. A new guard once thought it was a costumed visitor until he realized she had no face. Just a faint silhouette, pale hands, and the head resting between them. Since then, no one dares take the night shift on May 19th without a small cross or whispered prayer tucked in their pocket. St. Peter ad Vincula Chapel. The grave with no name. Even Anna's burial place is strange. She has no proper grave, no marker, no inscription. It wasn't until the 19th century, when a team restoring the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula began lifting the old stone floor, that they discovered the unmarked remains of a woman buried beneath the altar. And they believed it was Anne Boleyn. It's said that since that excavation, every night, there are faint footsteps in the chapel, as if someone still comes to attend a ceremony that never happened. One nun claimed to have seen a pale green glow spreading from the stone altar at midnight, though no candles were lit and no moonlight could enter through the windows. The mirror room and the silent corridor. One of the most frequently told phenomena since the 18th century comes from the White Tower, the main building of the Tower of London. Some have described that when standing before an old mirror in an eastern room, you might see a woman in a Tudor gown standing behind you in the reflection. But when you turn around, no one is there. A young guard once nearly quit after seeing the mirror crack without cause, only for it to be perfectly intact the next morning, as though it had never shattered. Many visitors describe a feeling of being watched or hearing someone whisper, even when they are alone. The footsteps aren't loud, they drag softly like bare feet across cold stone. A ghost. Not angry, just sad. What sets Anne's story apart from other ghost legends is that she doesn't return to scare, scream, or throw objects. Anna's ghost appears more like a memory, a leftover drop from a storm that has already passed. Whether passing by with her head in her arms or as a vague silhouette, there's always something still sorrowful and strangely beautiful about her, as if this soul never received a proper farewell. Historians believe Anne lingers not just because she was killed, but because she was erased. And those who are deliberately forgotten rarely leave quietly. The whispers in portraits. There is a portrait said to be of Anne, painted years after her death, that hangs in an old castle in Kent. It is said that when the lights in the room are turned off, the eyes in the painting seem to shift, first looking to the left, then slowly gazing directly toward the door. A nobleman who once lived in the castle wrote in his journal, "I swear I heard a woman whisper, 'Catherine, Jane.' And then what am I, though I was alone in the room? Is it true? Perhaps not, but as you know, some things in history do not need to be verified, only felt." When Elizabeth came to the tower, the strangest detail of all, it is said that in the first year of Elizabeth's reign, when she visited the Tower of London to inspect the armory, she lingered a long while at Tower Green, the place where her mother had been executed. She said nothing, just stood, and then silently walked away. That night, guards reported that the wind carried the scent of dried roses, though there were no roses in season. You see, a woman beheaded may die in seconds, but her memory, especially when distorted, forgotten, or erased, can echo for centuries. Anne Boleyn didn't become a ghost to frighten you. She became a shadow to remind us that even those who were cast out of history are still here. In the wind, in the stone, in the mirror, and in the stories told as you are trying to fall asleep. Have you ever imagined how a woman who lived her life between a crown and suspicion would finally die? Not in glory, not with music and cheers, but in a cold room by flickering candlelight with an empty bed beside her. When Elizabeth reached the age of 69, an extraordinary age for a woman of her time, she still tried to stand tall with thick powder golden wigs and the firm voice of a ruler. But inside, her body had begun to betray her. sleeplessness, trembling hands, back pain, an irregular heartbeat, and memory drifting like morning mist. Sleepless nights and the returning ghosts. In the winter of 1602, Elizabeth began refusing to sleep. She said, "If I lie down, I may never rise again." Servants pleaded, physicians begged, but Elizabeth simply sat, on the floor, in a white gown, eyes wide open, silent, sleepless. Attendants recalled her murmuring names Robert, Mary, Anne, then falling silent once more. At times she whispered an old poem. Sometimes she gave a soft smile, a smile that no longer belonged to the present. Her advisors gradually understood she wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of being forgotten. And do you know what's strange? Many believe that in those final nights, Anne Boleyn returned. Not as a blood-soaked apparition or a headless ghost, but as a dream where Elizabeth saw a woman standing beneath the apple tree in the garden, with long black hair, a gray silk dress, and a gentle voice. "You did it. Now, rest." The next morning, ladies-in-waiting said Elizabeth asked, "That girl, was she real?" Then fell silent again. Letting go of the crown and a farewell, no one dared hear. By late March 1603, Elizabeth could no longer speak, but she still refused to lie in bed. They had to place cushions over the cold stone floor so she could sit supported. Those few allowed to see her in those final days all said her eyes were bright, but seemed to look straight through them. Everyone knew she was saying goodbye, not with words, but with her gaze. And then with her final breath, Elizabeth gently motioned with her hand, as if waving to someone on the other side. No one knows who. Some say it was her mother. Others believe it was Robert Dudley, the first love that never had a name. A death without fanfare and a dynasty grown silent on March 24th, 1603. Elizabeth had died. No loud weeping, no cries of mourning, no grand funeral right away, because everyone understood a dynasty had ended, and a chapter of history had quietly settled into dust. Her body was placed in a white velvet-covered coffin adorned with white roses, the symbol of the House of Tudor. As the procession moved through the streets of London, thousands stood silently. No shouting, no sobbing, only bowed heads. And do you know what's strange, they say? That night the moon over London changed color from silver to a dull gray, as if the sky itself was mourning. An old guard later said, "That night I saw the shadows of two women, standing on the Tower Bridge, one in a gray Tudor dress, the other in white. They didn't speak, just stared out at the Thames and disappeared." Since then, people have believed Elizabeth finally reunited with her mother. No longer queen and victim, but two souls who understood each other better than anyone in the history of England. Are you still awake? If you're still here, then perhaps you understand the saddest stories aren't the bloody deaths. They're the silent ones of those who lived their whole lives trying not to be forgotten. Elizabeth, never married, never had children, never allowed anyone to fully touch her heart. But she gave herself entirely to a country. And her final ending is a message that even in solitude, if you live for something greater than yourself, you never truly die alone. Sleep well. And if you dream, may you meet a queen who steps out from the mist, smiles gently, and disappears in peace.